In this tutorial, we're going to learn 3 new things. The first thing is called pre-masking, and this is when we play with our raw file in order to create a selection which is perfect for exposure blending. Essentially, we're making a raw file or an image which will make a beautiful mask that will allow us to blend our exposures really easily. The second thing that we're going to look at is how to blend images when there's been movement between exposures. So for example, when I was taking my ND filter off the camera and on the camera, that was moving the lens a tiny bit. And so it's impossible to blend these exposures without aligning them in Photoshop. The thing with Photoshop is they won't allow us to blend in smart objects. So we have to rasterize our layers to make them normal layers, auto align them, and then blend them. But in the last exposure blending video, you saw something called matching, where we match the brightness values of different exposures by going back into Adobe Camera Raw and manipulating the raw files, and then they all match together. But if we're rastering our layers, we can't do that because of course they're flat layers. We have no more access to Adobe Camera Raw. So I'm going to show you how to get around that. And that's linked in with pre-masking that I talked about earlier. And the third thing we're going to look at is how to create a really cool long exposure effect in Photoshop. Now we are working with ND filter images here. They're 30-second images and they're already long exposures, but I could only work with 30 seconds because it was the middle of the day. There was a huge amount of light in the scene and that's all I could stretch out for my 10-stop ND filter. And because I was using my B&W filter, which is a screw-on, I couldn't stack filters, so I couldn't stretch out that shutter speed any longer than 30 seconds. So I took 3 separate exposures instantly after each other, all 30-second exposures like you see here, and then instantly after I took another one, and instantly after that I took another one. And we can combine these in Photoshop to make an even longer exposure effect. And I'm going to show you how to do that in a few steps. Now let's take a proper look at our raw files. So again, this is one dark exposure, this is another, and this is the third one. And finally, this is our base exposure. Now this, as you can see, isn't a long exposure, it's a short exposure. Now the reason why I captured this shot without an ND filter is because I wanted a quick image where the sun would come out, and it was only out for a few seconds at a time because it was very cloudy, and just capture these long shadows here. With an ND filter, say at a 30-second shutter speed, even if the sun came out and went back in again, it would create inconsistent shadows and the lighting wouldn't be the same. So I took my ND filter off and I just waited until the right shot came along. And of course I took a lot of different exposures, but this is the one I think is the best, certainly for those long shadows. So let's have a proper look at our raw files here. So we have on top the darker exposure, and then we have another dark exposure and another dark exposure, which we're going to blend together to create that long exposure effect I was talking about. And then we have our base exposure, which is really bright but has these long shadows. And essentially we want to get the sky from the darker exposures into the same frame as our base exposure. So we want this beautiful foreground with the long shadows and also at the same time the moving sky from the long exposures. So in the previous video we looked at matching, and this is where we match the brightness levels of the darkest exposure to that of the base exposure. And we're going to do that again now, but just by bringing up our shadows a little bit, and by bringing up our exposure a tiny bit, and by bringing down our highlights a touch. We don't want to bring them down too much. And we certainly don't want to bring our sliders along too much because that creates a lot of image degradation. So we want to just keep it right without adding any halos or noise or anything like that. So with that done, typically when we're matching, we just bring down the highlights of the base exposure. Now, if you don't know what matching is, if you missed the video on matching, please go to the interior post-processing video, and that's where I show you how to match and how important matching is to create a clean, natural blend with lots of contrast. So like I said, we typically bring down the highlights when we're matching, but this is going to create a few problems, and I'm going to show you exactly what I mean soon. Now let's try and edit this exposure, make it a bit darker because it's a bit bright. Remember, we want our base exposure to be the ideal exposure to work with, and that one was too bright. So I'm just bringing down the exposure a little bit, just bringing up the foreground a tiny bit. So I think that's pretty good. Now I'm going to select all of these exposures as usual, go to Lens Corrections, remove Chromatic Aberration and enable Profile Corrections. And I'm going to hold down Shift and open Objects. And with the images in Photoshop, as usual, I'll open up Instamask and stack the exposures. So now we have our 3 dark exposures on top and our base exposure in the bottom. The problem here is that the images are misaligned. You can see as I make them visible and invisible, there's movement between the exposures. So this is when I was putting the ND filter in and out, and clearly the camera's moved slightly. So to get a better view of that, I'm just going to zoom into these rocks and I can change this exposure, its blend mode, to difference. And this shows you the difference between exposures. And as we can see, there's misalignment here on the edge of these rocks. Now, usually we can choose the Move tool, click on the exposure, and use our arrow keys on the keyboard to align our shots. But here, that isn't going to work. You can see this main rock here, that is nicely aligned because it doesn't have a large edge on it. But these ones do. So clearly there's some distortion from the lens between these shots as well. So we're going to have to rely on Photoshop's auto align function instead. The problem is that Photoshop doesn't align smart objects. If we select all of our layers and go to Edit, Auto Align, you see it's grayed out. Now to rasterize them, in other words to make them normal layers, we can right click on them and choose Rasterize Layers. And that'll make normal layers, and we can go to Edit, Auto Align and press OK. Now let's assume Photoshop has aligned these layers correctly. It has sadly given us a little bit of a problem. Since we've already matched these exposures in Adobe Camera Raw, the sky in the base exposure is extremely dark. And that's going to make it really hard to create a mask. If you remember, the masks are created on whatever image we have in front of us here. So let me show you what I mean. I want to select the sky, so I need the sky to be bright in the mask. And I need the foreground to be relatively dark. So I'm going to open up Instamask and choose the brights one. And instantly we see that the sky is dark. There's a lot of information in there, which means we're going to have real difficulty in creating a mask. But I'm going to bring this slider along just to try and refine the mask. And that really isn't working very well because we still have lots of the sky, which is quite dark. Nevertheless, I'm going to apply the mask to this layer. And if we look at the sky, we'll see we have these kind of gray blotches up here. See this line here, which shouldn't be there. If I make the mask invisible, see it's much smoother. So here's before and after. So afterwards, we're getting these blotches all over the sky and it doesn't look very good. And again, that's because our sky and our base exposure, where we're building the masks, is simply too visible. We need the sky to be white. Now that would be quite easy if they were all smart objects because we could just open up Adobe Camera Raw, we could bring the highlights up and that would make the sky overexposed and then we could create a mask. But they're not smart objects anymore. So how can we blend these exposures with a good mask while leaving them as rasterized layers? Well, there is an easy way to do that, and that's by duplicating the background layer. But before we do any of that, I'm going to go back to when all of these layers were smart objects. So now we're back to our smart objects. All I'm going to do here is duplicate this background layer, but I'm not going to press Ctrl and J or Command and J. I'm going to right click on the layer and choose New Smart Object Fire Copy. Then I'm going to double click on this layer and I'm going to press Default and I'm going to bring the highlights all the way up and bring the shadows down a little bit just to darken the exposure. And so what we're doing here is we're trying to create the perfect mask. In our ideal mask, we want the sky to be white or light, and we want the foreground to be relatively dark, but not completely black. And I think this would probably give us a good selection. So I'm going to press OK, and I'm going to call this layer Pre-Mask. Now this layer is the key to our exposure blending here. If we make all of our other layers visible, and we turn these again into rasterized layers, we can once again go to Edit, Auto Align, and press OK. And now we're going to align our layers. Now, even though Photoshop's aligned our layers, we don't have to assume that it's done it correctly. So I'm going to zoom in to these rocks here, for example, and I'm going to make the other layers invisible. and I'm going to change this layer again to difference. And you can see we've got a little bit of edging on the left hand side of these rocks. And I'm just going to have a look at some other areas. So we've got edging there too, and probably edging on the right hand rock too here. So we're going to have to manually align these layers just a little bit. And we want all of these changes to affect all three of our darker exposures, which is really easy to do. We just select our darker exposures, right click and go to link layers. Now I'm going to choose the move tool and I make sure my top layer is selected. Click once on the exposure and choose my arrow tools to move the image right. Now I'm just going to move them up and down and left and right just to make sure that they're correctly aligned. And I think that's pretty much as close as we're going to get to an aligned image. So if I just change this exposure to normal and do a quick before and after, yeah, you can see there's pretty much no movement between the exposures there. So I'm going to zoom out, and now we're ready to create that long exposure effect I was talking about. So we want to use all three of our dark exposures to create a much smoother effect in the clouds, where the clouds really stretch out across the screen. And that's really easy. We just select all three of them, we right click, and we choose Convert to Smart Object. When that's done, we go to Layer, Smart Objects, all the way down to Stack Mode, and then we go to Mean. And Mean's going to create a mean value for each pixel in this image. And you'll see it just stretches out these clouds beautifully. So here's the before, and here's the after. We've created a much more appealing, longer exposure effect. And the reason why I like this is because it contrasts beautifully with the static detailed textures in the foreground and these pointy rocks that stick out. And it's a really cool technique which we can use with short exposures as well. So for example, if you're shooting a seascape or you've got some moving clouds and you haven't got your ND filter, just keep shooting off images constantly as the clouds move. Try to make sure there's not too much time between exposures, and then bring all of your exposures into Photoshop. The more the merrier, and do exactly the same thing, and you'll create an incredible fake long exposure effect. Now let's look at blending the exposures. So before, when we try to blend the exposures with this base image, which we've already used for matching, we got a really bad mask. So that's what a bright swan looks like. It's kind of gray in the sky, but we wanted the sky to be white or really light gray. But now that we've created this pre-mask, you can see the sky's really bright in this image. So if we press Bright Swan and Instamask, now our mask is fantastic. We've got almost no detail in the sky. And if we move the slider along, we've got even less detail. We bring in our midtones, we're creating a really precise contrasting mask. And with that done, I can press Select, make the darker exposure visible, choose a black mask, press B for brush, and make sure I've got a white foreground and a big brush, and press Command and H or Control and H to hide the marching ants, and I can just paint in this darker exposure. And we just want to do it once. Now you'll notice that it doesn't look particularly natural. I'm not talking about the rocks in the middle here. I just mean the general blend in the image. And that's because we've got pre-mask visible. And that's not what we're going to use in the long run. We're just going to use this to create the mask. So if I make this invisible, watch the difference that we see. We all of a sudden have a much more natural blend. Especially if you look at these mountains here or these hills, they're kind of lacking a bit of contrast now. They're a little bit gray. And when we make the base exposure visible, it becomes much more contrasting and natural. So that pre-mask layer has made a huge difference in the exposure blending. Just by duplicating our background layer and playing with the highlight slider and the shadow slider, we've managed to save ourselves so much time in exposure blending. Now, usually when we're exposure blending with smart objects, we don't need to duplicate the background layer. First, we pre-mask. So we bring up the highlights, so we make them nice and visible, and we make sure they're really overexposed. Then we blend our exposures just like we've done. And then, once we've done that, we can open up Adobe Camera Raw again, bring down the sliders, and start matching exposures. And that's generally how I blend exposures in Photoshop. Now it's quite obvious that the blending hasn't been very natural in these rocks here. And even if we use matching, it's never going to be natural here, because if I just make this mask invisible, you can see that the side of these rocks has no light on it. The sun didn't come out during the time when I was shooting. But in the base exposure, the sun has come out. So no matter what happens in terms of adjusting the raw file, we're always going to flatten that part of the rock. But it's quite easy to correct. All we need to do is select the Magic Wand tool, press Command and D or Control and D to deselect any active selections, and just run the tool down the objects that we want to remove from the selection. Now you see we've just had a little bit of a mistake here where the selection is in the sky. So again, we take our tool, we press the minus sign, and all we do is just push that along until it's off the rock. So with that done, I can zoom out. I choose my paintbrush. I select the mask of the dark exposure. I set my foreground to white with an 100% opacity, and I press Command and H or Control and H. And watch this, I can just paint out that section. But I think this rock here is a little bit bright. It doesn't look very natural. But since we've still got this selection active for this rock, I can open up a curves layer and I can bring down the brightness level of that area. And you can see we're darkening it quite naturally. But there's some harsh edging where the selection ends. So we can bring up the shadows just a little bit. We're creating a more natural rock which complements the brightness of the sky. So that's before and after. You see, it was just a little bit too bright. And if we find that the edging is still obvious here, we can just choose our brush, press Command and D or Control and D to deselect our active selection. And we can just paint out that area. Now I think the sky is a little bit bright in this exposure. So if you're not an Instamask user, how do we do this? Well, I'm going to leave this selection active because we've already seen how to do that. And I'm going to delete this layer and make the darker exposure invisible. I'm going to go to the actions, down to my easy actions, and we're going to go to dark exposure luminosity masks. We need to make pre-mask visible because that's where we build the mask around. And I'm just going to press play. And now I can bring the sliders along as I please, just until we have a good selection of the sky. I think that should do it, and press OK. And now I'm going to press Command or Control on a PC and click on the temp mask thumbnail. Make sure my brush is set to white. I'm going to make the darker exposure visible, make it a nice big brush, and press Command and H or Control and H to hide the marching ants. And I'm just going to go once around this image here. And when that's done, again, I'm going to take this selection that we've already made. I'm going to press Command and D or Control and D to deselect the luminosity masks. I'm going to press Command or Control on a PC and left click on this mask. And I'm going to press Command and H. I'm going to select the darker exposure. And I'm going to choose a black foreground. And we're just going to paint out that brighter exposure. And there you go, we've darkened it too. And now I'm going to delete the pre-mask because we don't need it anymore. And that, of course, has made it a much more natural blend. So I know that that process seems quite complex, and I've purposefully chosen a really difficult image to process, because otherwise how can we learn anything new if everything's quite easy to do? So don't worry if it's a little bit complex. You can go through this video a few times and just try the idea of pre-masking beforehand. So open up your images in Adobe Camera Raw and bring up the highlight slider before you do anything else in your base exposure. And when it comes to generating your masks on your darker exposure, you'll see it's much easier to create that selection of the sky or whatever it is you're trying to select. Once you've done that and you've applied the mask to the darker exposure, open up Adobe Camera Raw again and bring the highlight slider down. And you'll see it becomes such a natural blend once you do that. So again, don't worry if this is a little bit complex, just experiment with it in your own time and see how it works for you. So now the one thing you might have noticed about this scene is that the colors, the cast in each of the images is different. Now, the reason why is because in my long exposure, I used the B&W ND filter, which is famous for having a really warm color cast. Now, a lot of the time I love that color cast. I think it looks great. And I especially like it in this scene. But the coloring in the foreground is different to the coloring in the sky, of course. So there are different ways that we can deal with that. Well, I'm going to show you how we can match colors between exposures. So let's say we want to correct the warm colors in the sky. So we want to make the colors consistent with the colors in this sky. That's quite easy if we just right click on the darker exposure and choose rasterize layer. We don't need it as a smart object anymore. Now we can go to image, adjustments and match color. And here we're going to go to source, and that's just basically this window here. And just watch the sky as we do this. The layer we're going to choose is DSC5363 because that's the name of this layer here. And watch the color of the sky as we do that. It becomes white and blue. Now obviously it doesn't look very good, it looks a little bit bright and the colors are a little bit off. So what we can do is we can change the color intensity and we can make it more natural, or we can make it a little bit darker. And so essentially all we're doing here is matching the values of the long exposure with the short exposure. And press OK. And so this is before and this is after. See, that's a huge difference and it looks really natural. We didn't have to color correct in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. We can just use our base exposure as the foundation from which we build all the other colors. Alternatively, let's undo that and we can go to the base exposure and we can do this again. We can go to adjustments, match color, and this time when we select our image, we can go to dark. And that, as you can see, has made the foreground much warmer. So I can bring up the luminance here, and that's going to brighten up the foreground. And we can keep going with that until it looks a bit more natural. And if we wanted, we can bring down the color intensity just a little bit so it's not too strong. Make a few more adjustments here and try and get it to a reasonably warm but correctly exposed image. And I think that looks pretty good, so I'm going to press OK. So let's look at these two exposures comparatively. I'm going to make this mask invisible. And this is the dark exposure, and now this is the bright exposure. So you can see the coloring is pretty much identical. And when we blend the two together, we've got a pretty good natural scene. There's a lot of continuity when it comes to the coloring or the cast in the photo. So before we move on, I'm just going to delete this temp mask here. And now the first thing I want to do is actually darken the sky just a little bit. It's a bit overexposed. Now the reason why I do that is because often our eyes are drawn to the brightest thing in the image, especially when that bright thing is quite large like this sky. But really, where we want our viewer to look in this image is at the rocks to the right and also to the shadows in the foreground. I think that's more impactful. So the sky's just a little bit too distracting right now. So what I've done is I've held down Command or Control on a PC and then I clicked on the darker exposure mask, and that gave us our selection of the sky that we had before. Then I created a curves layer, and you can see our mask has been applied to that curves layer. So if we open up the curve and just bring the sky down a tiny bit, we can make it still natural but a lot less distracting. So that's a really big improvement, and by default it brings out some extra textures in the sky. So I'm going to actually do that a tiny bit more. So that's the before and after. That's very good. And it also darkens the hills in the horizon here, which looks really good. Now the next thing I want to do is crop the image because we've got some edging along here that we need to get rid of. And you can take finer control of a crop. If you bring your edges in and you see that it keeps snapping to, you can press Control. And you see it gives you full control over the crop. You decide where you want the edge to be. So roughly about there should do the job. And you can see we're conforming to the rule of thirds to some degree here. And so we can press OK. And now it's time to deepen some mood. And the best way to do that, which I've shown you a few times, is through a levels layer, bringing up the shadows significantly, and then bringing down the midtones, and just creating that closer feel with your contrast. And we're bringing along the highlights to give the image some kick. And we're just trying to soften the shadows, but at the same time darken the whole mood of the scene. So that's before and after. So we're just softening those shadows just a little bit. Next, why don't we try a little Orton effect? So I'm going to press Command, Alt, Shift and E and create a new layer. Then I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And I usually leave my settings at around 44 and bring my opacity all the way down to around 12%. And it just softens the image nicely. Gives it a much more gentle feel. And then I press Command and L or Control and L and just bring the highlights along a touch. And the shadows too. And press OK. So there's the before and after. Now we're going to dodge and burn just a little bit, and we're going to use the same process that you saw before. By the way, for Raya Pro users, you know how to do the Orton effect already. We simply go to Enhancements and choose Orton effect here. So to dodge and burn, we're going to use the same dodge and burn process we used previously. And we're going to dodge the highlights. So I'm going to select highlights and press play. And I'm going to bring the highlights along. Again, Raya Pro users, you'll see this under the DB section and in enhancements, and you'll see highlights and shadows. So when I've made a good selection, I'm trying to get a good selection here of this foreground, just because we're going to brighten it up and maybe add a little bit of color to it. I think that's a pretty good job. And press OK. So again, Raya Pro users, you just need to go to Enhance, Enhancements, and Highlights or Shadows. So on this occasion, use Highlights. Now when that's done, we can choose a brush. We're going to set our color to, let's say, somewhere like this. And we want to make it just maybe a little bit warmer and make a bigger brush and bring the opacity all the way down. Let's just say to around 20% for now, 25%. And we're just painting in some warmth in these areas and also a little bit of light as well. So I'm going to make this a bit more visible, this layer. And look at that, before and after. We've added some gorgeous color and light to the scene. Now I'm actually going to duplicate this layer by pressing Command and J or Control and J, but I'm going to choose the eraser tool and I'm going to erase everything from that duplicated layer. We don't want any colors added because it made it a little bit oversaturated. We just want to now brighten up that exposure. And we do that instead, not with a color, but with white. So I've chosen a white foreground and I'm just brightening up the foreground a little bit here. And we're going to bring down the opacity of this area just so it's not too bright. There we go. So here is the before and after. This is before we started, and that's the color that we added, and that's the brightness that we've added too. So it has a nice overall effect on that area. Now we want to try and stretch out some of these shadows as well. So this time we're going to play our action, but we're going to choose shadows. And so we just press play, and that's given us a very general selection of our shadows, so we can bring the mid-tone slider all the way along, and even our shadow slider. And what we're trying to do here is select these areas along here, the whiter areas, just to try and separate them from the brighter areas that we've already dodged. So I'm just bringing those areas along just to make it a more contrasting mask. And I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to press OK. And now to darken this, all we do is make sure we have our foreground set to black. We've got our paintbrush. We've selected the layer and not the mask. And now we can just burn down these areas. You see, we're not affecting the brighter areas. We're just doing a little bit of dodging here. And perhaps just to create a little vignette, a natural vignette, we're going to burn around here too. And possibly on the side of this rock as well. Maybe even along here. We're just trying to make some contrast between this side of the rock and the brighter side of the rock. And then when we're done, we can actually change this to soft light to make it a bit more gentle and bring the opacity all the way down. So there's the before and after. So we've just stretched out those shadows a little bit more. And in doing so, we've given the image just a little bit more depth. Now I'm just going to paint over this area as well, give this area a little bit more contrast. And what about on the horizon here? Is there anything else we can darken? There we go. We are essentially making more contrast between the darker and brighter areas. Now, I don't actually want these rocks to be too contrasting. So I'm going to mask out some of that by selecting this mask. I'm going to bring the opacity of this up to about 12, setting my opacity at around 40% of the brush, and just masking out some of those areas. So that's the before and after. So let's just have a look at the overall changes here. This is before the dodging and burning, and that's after dodging and burning. So we have given the scene a little bit more life, a little bit more depth. Now there is one more thing I want to do, and that's burn the side of these rocks just a little bit. And now it isn't going to be easy to do that because we can't make an accurate selection based on shadows and highlights. So I'm just going to do it a destructive way through dodging and burning in Photoshop. So that means I'm going to have to merge all these layers by holding Command, Option, Shift and E, or Control, Alt, Shift and E on a PC. And I'm going to choose the Magic Wand tool. And again, I'm going to select all of these rocks just as I've done before. And I just want to do a little bit of dodging really on the side of these rocks. And I'm going to zoom in to this rock just to make sure that we've selected the outside of this area here. That's pretty good. It doesn't need to be too exact. Then I'm going to press Command and H to hide the marching ants, and I'm going to choose the Dodge tool. And we've got mid-tone selected, and I just want to brighten up the side of this rock. And I'm going to do it a tiny bit on this bit here as well. So what we're doing here is we're adding, as I said quite a few times, we're adding extra depth to these objects. And by doing that, they look slightly more three-dimensional. We're bringing out more textures, and we're giving that light on the right-hand side of the image more strength. So I'm going to press Command and D now that I've done that. And I'm going to do the same thing in this valley here. I'm just going to brighten up these midtones because I think they were a little bit dark. And then I'm going to do a little bit down here too. These are all areas that are a little bit too difficult to reach for the actions that I've included in this download. And that's just because their brightness isn't discernible from the objects around them. So here is the before and after. Before and after. You see, we've given those rocks fantastic life. Now, I do think this rock in the middle is perhaps a little bit strong, so I'm going to check my paintbrush, set my foreground to black, and I've got my opacity set to 40%. I'm just going to paint along there. So that's the before and after. And remember that these are the interesting subjects in our image. So we need to give them life. We need to separate them from the foreground and from the background. And the best way to do that often is through dodging and burning. Now I still think this sky's a little bit too bright, so I want to darken some of it. And all I need to do, we already have done that here with this layer. I'm going to press Command and J or Control and J, and I've duplicated it. I'm going to bring it to the top of the layers, and there we've immediately darkened the sky. But this time I'm just going to brighten some of it, just darken some of the midtones. And what I'm looking for here is darkening mainly this area here. Now this is far too dark and it's affected the colors. So we want to change the blend mode of this layer to luminosity. So it's not oversaturating that layer. We want to bring down the opacity a tiny bit. And I want to select the mask, and I want to mask out some of the areas in the top right hand corner here because they're just too dark. And I'm going to do the same with this area under the cloud here. That's a little bit too dark and distracting. And certainly with this area here, which is also really dark. So let's have a look if that's okay. That's the before and after. I think that's a really nice improvement. And so now I'm going to give this image one final contrast adjustment with a levels layer, just to make sure we've got a nice balance of contrast. So I'm going to bring the highlights all the way along, just in line with the peak here, so we don't have too many overexposed highlights. The further we bring it, the more exposed and harsh the image becomes. So I'm just bringing it along a little bit. And would it be an improvement if we brought the midtones along? No, I don't think it would. I think that would probably make it a little bit underexposed. So again, I'm just going to bring the highlights along and just leave it at that, just to give it a little bit more brightness. And now that we've finished, I always leave the cleaning of my images right till the very end. And to clean them, I open up a new layer, And so there's quite a bit of lens dirt here because I was shooting in an aperture of f/22 to try and really draw out the exposures. So it picks up, of course, all the dirt on my lens or on my sensor, and it doesn't look very good. So I'm just trying to clean the image, and it's going to take a little bit of time, but it's worth it in the long run. And just to show you a different way to do this, if you find any difficult spots, we can use the patch tool, but we can't use it on a new layer. We have to use it on a stamped layer, which again is using Command, Option, Shift and E, or Control, Alt, Shift and E. But instead, Raya Pro users, you can just press merge. And essentially what we can do here is just select the area around the lens dirt. Make sure your setting is at source and just drag over to an area without the lens dirt. And Photoshop usually does a pretty good job of matching the brightness and textures so it looks pretty natural. So I think we have a bird somewhere up here. So I'm just going to select the bird, and there we go. Now we don't want to go through all of this because you're going to get really bored if you just sit and watch me clone things out and remove things. So instead, I'm just going to make this nice and big, and I noticed we had a bit of a line at the top. I'm not exactly sure where that's from, and I'm just going to crop this down, press OK, and then I'm going to go all the way down to these people in the foreground who are in the image, and I'm just going to remove these out, and this is the last thing I'm going to do. And it looks like actually we can crop up a little bit too. So again, I'm going to choose the patch tool, and let's see if this works. I'm going to select around the woman, and I'm going to choose, let's say, this area here. Press Command and D, and that's actually done a pretty good job, even though it doesn't look natural. I mean, even if you zoom in at 100%, no one can really tell what's going on there. So the only problem is some areas have been duplicated, but we can fix that soon. And again, that's done an all right job. And if you do have any duplicated areas, like for example, this bit and this bit, it kind of looks obvious that you've cloned something out. So we just need to copy something around that area and just clone it out a little bit. So here's the before and after. That's what it looked like before, and that's after. And I think that looks okay. Now we've got a few other tourists around here, so let's see if we can remove them. I'm going to choose the patch tool, and I'm just going to copy around this lady here. And that looks very good. And again, I'm going to copy around this lady. And I'll copy around this guy. And Photoshop really has done a fantastic job of removing these people. So just to make sure it doesn't look like we have any duplicated areas, I'm going to make a selection just left of this line here and just see if we can clone that area out. I've kind of copied another area instead. And now maybe grab this area here, clone this bit there. Yeah, and that looks much more natural. So here's before and after. You could never really tell anyone was standing there. And the fortunate thing is, because all of the textures and patterns are all inconsistent naturally, it doesn't really matter if it doesn't look perfect, because no one could tell the difference anyway, unless they live there and see the location every day. So now I'm just going to choose the crop tool again and just crop out the bottom end there. And so that is the final image. We've got a balanced scene with no overexposed highlights. We've merged in a long exposure and a short exposure, and we've learned some new techniques. So this is the before image that we worked with, where you see the base exposure, and this is the underexposed image, and this is the final image. Now guys, I know this is a complex tutorial. I know there's some interesting things that you need to probably practice a bit, but there's a lot of great stuff in this video to help you move forward with all types of post-processing, not just processing long exposures. So I hope you practice a few times and watch this video a few times just to see how powerful these techniques really are.